All right, so today we're going to be going over our analog six-pack. If you're sitting inside the plane, this is what you're going to be seeing for your airspeed indicator. We're going to have a 0, about 100, and then alongside here we'll have our white arc. But in this case it's blue because I don't have a white marker. Do they even sell white markers? And if you're looking inside of the cockpit, you're looking at the airspeed indicator, and then as your airspeed becomes alive, it'll start to indicate airspeed alive, and then eventually you'll climb at VY, VX. So this is if you're looking at the airspeed indicator head on. Inside of this airspeed indicator, behind the firewall, we have our airspeed indicator casing, which probably looks something like that, to be honest. And inside of the casing, we have this little thing called a diaphragm. That diaphragm expands and contracts like a balloon, and I'm going to explain to you how it expands and contracts like a balloon. Then we have our V0. When you're in a climb, you're usually trying to climb at 500 feet per minute, and when you're in a descent, you usually try to descend at 500 feet per minute. Now our VSI, this is what it looks like when you're looking at it head on. And then inside of that firewall, there's a little casing for it. It probably looks something like this. And inside of it, it also has a diaphragm. And that diaphragm expands and contracts just like a balloon. And then we have our altimeter, which I didn't leave no space to draw, but we'll just draw it down here. When you're looking at altimeter head on, this is what it looks like. You got one little hand, one big hand, then 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4, 5, and so on. And inside the firewall, that's what it looks like. So here's the firewall. What you're looking at is the little dial, the circle, inside of the firewall. The altimeter also has a little balloon-like thing that expands and contracts, but it's not called a diaphragm. It's called an aneroid wafer. So now we're going to explain to you how these expand and contract. And there's little gears in there. There's little linkages, and then there's little gears. I'm trying to draw a gear, but pen's too big. And then it is attached to our instruments, and it allows the little hands to move. Airspeed indicator hand and the little hands to move. Everything's attached to linkages and gears. Now we're going to talk about how does the diaphragm inside of the airspeed indicator expand and contract. That diaphragm is attached to something that we use during our pre-flight almost every single day, our pitot tube. When we're sitting on the ground, there's usually light winds, not strong enough to cause enough pressure or enough winds. You could think of winds and pressure interchangeable to go into the pitot tube and cause that needle to start to move. But if it was like gusting 30 degrees on the ground and there's enough headwind going into the pitot tube and enough pressure going in there, that needle will become alive and you will have airspeed alive while you're sitting down on the ground. But usually when you go full throttle, there's enough pressure going into the pitot tube and that needle will start to swing. And the reason why that needle's swinging is because that pressure going in the pitot tube, you could think about it as a balloon, is causing that diaphragm to expand. And then when you pull back the power, you're coming into land, you got less power in there. There's less pressure and less winds going into the pitot tube, causing that diaphragm to contract. Then we also have something else that we look at during every pre-flight to make sure there's no bugs or it's not covered in any way, and that's our static port pressure. Our static port pressure is also used by the airspeed indicator to fill in the casing. So the diaphragm is filled in by the pitot tube, and then the casing, the pressure goes in there from the static port pressure. And the reason why we need the static port as well as the pitot tube and not just the pitot tube is because there's also static pressure around the pitot tube that gets sucked in there by the dynamic pressure that's violently going in there. It's kind of causing, I won't go into too much details with that, but it's kind of causing like a Bernoulli's principle where it's like low pressure going in there and it's sucking in all that static pressure all around it and also pushing it in there. So if we only use the pitot tube to get both our static housing pressure and our diaphragm pressure, then it would just read inaccurately because it's dynamic and static pressure going in there at the same time. So we use our static port to offset that static pressure that's being sucked in there also, but I don't think you ever need to go into detail. And then our VSI uses the static port to fill the diaphragm and to also fill the housing. So our VSI is actually like a trend indicator, and it's not something that we use to fly the plane. The reason why is because it lags behind whatever's actually going on. So the diaphragm in there has a little tiny drain hole, which causes a calibrated leak. What does that mean? It means that that hole is too little to let all of the static pressure escape at once. So it escapes very slowly, and then it starts to show a trend that lags behind what's actually going on. So a simpler way to explain that would be if you're climbing at 500 feet per minute and then you level off quickly and you start to push down and you start to descend, it might still show that you're in a climb before it actually lags behind what's going on and actually starts to descend. And that's because the pressure doesn't escape all at once. It escapes very slowly. The housing on the VSI, though, on the other hand, the pressure changes instantly with whatever's happened to the static port. So if you're in a descent, it'll automatically start to let out that pressure. It's not like the diaphragm. Now, our aneroid wafer works similar to our diaphragms, but is actually sealed with 2992 pressure inside of the little balloon-like thing that expands and contracts. And then the housing gets filled by the static pressure from the static port. So the more we climb, the less static pressure there is inside of our port, and it'll start to expand because there's less pressure in there while we're climbing. There's less pressure inside of the housing, so it'll start to expand. And when we start to descend, the more the pressure comes inside of the housing, and it causes that aneroid wafer to contract. So that's basically how they work. Now we could talk about the errors. Let's say that for some reason we get icing inside of our pitot tube, or a bee or a bug or something goes in there. I know you've been coming into land and you're like at 1,500 feet and all of a sudden, splat, a bug gets unalived on your windshield. So let's say a bug goes in there and blocks our pitot tube. There's zero pressure going in there or zero winds. So our airspeed indicator is going to read 0. So think about it. 0 winds going in there, 0 pressure going in there. Airspeed indicator is going to read 0. Now let's say our drain hole also gets clogged. Let's say that bug made its way all the way to the drain hole, then another one came and blocked the ram air. So now your ram air and your drain hole are blocked. Now this is going to behave like an aneroid wafer. This diaphragm is going to be sealed to whatever pressure was there, and then it's going to behave like an aneroid wafer because now it's sealed. So as you climb, there's going to be less pressure inside of the housing, but that's going to remain sealed. So it's going to show that you're in a climb. And then as you descend, there's going to be more pressure in there. And this is sealed because both of these got sealed. So it's going to start to contract, and it's going to start to show that you're in a descent. So it's going to behave as an altimeter. And that's the reason why it behaves as an altimeter. Now, let's say our static port pressure gets blocked. That means that our airspeed indicator is just going to freeze at whatever reading it is. If it's showing 50 miles an hour, it's just going to freeze at 50 miles an hour no matter what happens. Now, let's say that our static port gets blocked. How would our VSI behave? It's just going to automatically just read flat out 0. It's not going to show any other readings but 0. And static port gets blocked. What happens to our altimeter is going to freeze at whatever altitude you're at. So right now we're flying at, like, let's say 3,000 feet. I think that shows roughly about 3,000 feet. So let's say it freezes at 3,000 feet and then you descend down to 1,000 feet. Now your altimeter is going to show you that you're still at 3,000 feet. And you got to be careful because if there's like a mountain there at 2,500 feet, you're definitely going to run into it. So just be very careful with that. So that's pretty much it for our airspeed indicator, or VSI, and our aneroid wafer. Now we're going to go over a little bit more complicated stuff, which is the other 3 instruments in our analog system. And then we'll go over glass system because I'm trying to make this video fast like the Flash. All right, let's go over our attitude indicator, HSI, and our turn coordinator. So our attitude, HSI, and turn coordinator work off of 2 principles. One of them is rigidity in space. and the other one is precession. So how I explain rigidity in space, I'll just draw this out real quick. So rigidity in space, you could think about a 3-axis gimbal. If you guys don't know what a 3-axis gimbal, I'll show you guys what one looks like. It basically keeps the camera rotating level no matter what axis you rotate around it. So our attitude indicator and our HSI both have a 2-axis gimbal. Literally, both have a 2-axis gimbal holding on to a spinning disc. You have your 2-axis gimbal, and there's a spinning disc constantly spinning the whole entire time. So that 2-axis gimbal holds that spinning disc in place no matter which way the plane turns. If it's up or down, that's one axis. If it's left to right, that's another axis, and it holds it in place the whole entire time. And then our other law that works with our turn coordinator is precession. So there's a spinning gyro in there, and it has a 30-degree tilt. The 30-degree tilt is meant so that you're allowed to turn without the spinning gyro like being knocked out of place. But after you hit a certain amount of degrees, it'll actually cause it to topple, and you would need to land and have a mechanic reset it for you. The way that precession works is that when a pressure is applied to a spinning object, it reflects 90 degrees outwards in the direction of turn. And I'll try to explain that as best as I can. I wish I had a plane with me to explain it. But make pretend that this pen is a plane. So this is your fuselage, your empennage, and your cockpit. And these are your wings. When we pitch down, we're applying that force to the top of the propeller. So if we're in a climb pitching up, we're applying that force to the bottom of the propeller, causing it to reflect 90 degrees, which is here now because we're at the bottom and the propeller spins to the right. So that force is felt here, and it actually pushes the plane to the right. And then when we're in a descent, the propeller's spinning, we apply that pressure to go down, pitch down. That force is being applied to the top of the propeller, causing it to reflect 90 degrees outwards in the direction of turn, and that gives us a left turning tendency. So when we pitch up, we get a right turning tendency, and when we pitch down, we get a left turning tendency. And that's because where the forces are applied. If that doesn't make sense to you, just know that the direction of the turn is where the propeller is spinning, and that when we pitch down, we apply that force to the top of the propeller. We apply that force to the top of the propeller, and then it's felt 90 degrees outwards in the direction of turn. So that force that we're applying here is actually felt 90 degrees here, and it causes the plane to turn to the left. So that's how precession works. There's a spinning gyro in there, and when we turn, that force is applied to the top or the bottom, and it's felt 90 degrees outward in the direction of turn, and it gives us our turning in, and it gives us our turn rate with the little plane. So the little plane shifts, and it shows us that we're in a turn.